Hello everyone, this is Direwolf20 and welcome to part 2 of Direwolf20's Mod Spotlight, taking a look at thermal expansion. Last episode we covered a lot of machines that use RF. We covered pretty much all the machines that use RF. Some of them don't use RF at all, but this episode we're going to talk about the rest of the stuff in thermal expansion that's available to you. So for example, there are dynamos. These are basically engines that can produce RF for you, and they come with their own set of augments and abilities, which are pretty neat. We're also going to take a look at energy cells, which can store RF. We'll take a look at tanks that can store liquids, and we can take a look at caches that basically store items. So items, liquids, and energy storage. Pretty neat. So let's get started taking a look. So the first thing we'll look at is energy cells. These are your basic energy storage mechanic. The energy cell, as shown just a second ago, is crafted like so, and you're going to need an energy cell frame to go ahead and produce this thing. Neat. By default, it can go ahead and store or input and output 1,000 RF a tick, and it stores about, what's that, 2 million RF total? Neat. There's some information here, right? You can go ahead and change the redstone outputs and inputs, so if you want it to accept or output different amounts of RF, you can change that at a rate of 50, hold control for 5 or 1. Right clicks and left clicks, change it by 5 or 1. Pretty cool. And the same for output. So if you wanted to output a small amount, you can totally control how much is going in and out of this energy cell. Just like the machines in thermal expansion, you can upgrade these with upgrade kits. Boom, we now have a hardened energy cell, which can store 8 million RF and do a total of 4,000 RF a tick input or output. We can store 18 million for 9,000 RF a tick. We can do signalum upgrades, which gives us 16,000 RF a tick and 32 million storage, and then resonant storage. Cool. 50 million RF, I guess that is. Yeah, it looks about like 50 million. And 25,000 RF per tick in and out on each side. Super cool. And just like the configuration of your machines, you can go ahead and specify blue or orange or yellow. Blue meaning power is coming in. Orange means power is going out, and yellow means power is not doing either. So if you want to limit the power connections on certain sides, you can totally do that, and make sure that power is only allowed in on one side and orange is output. Neat. Finally, it should be noted, like I said, there is a creative conversion kit, which goes ahead and makes this a creative cell. This creative conversion kit does not have a recipe, at least not by default. Mod pack makers might add one, I don't know. But standard thermal expansion, no recipe for a creative conversion kit, no way to get a creative energy cell. It's what I've been using to demonstrate a lot of the features of thermal expansion. It's basically an infinite amount of RF energy. Cool. So if we want to go ahead and get some power into this energy cell, we're going to need some way of producing RF. And there are many different ways available in thermal expansion, among other mods that produce RF. We've all seen plenty of RF mods in 1.10, like extreme reactors and all kinds of other mods. So extra utilities, for example, has plenty of generators, right? We can see the generators are available there. You can totally use these generators to produce RF, and they'll work just fine. But this is a thermal expansion spotlight. So we're going to take a look at Steam Dynamo. This is the very first and most basic power generation option. The steam dynamo works by combining water with some kind of fuel source like coal or anything else that can be smelted in a furnace. And if you want to know all the options available, just grab your steam dynamo here in JEI and hit the U key to see the usable options. So a block of coal will produce 480,000 RF. Coal coke from thermal expansion will produce 64,000, charcoal 32,000 RF, and you can see the different amounts for like wood and ingots and all the normal stuff that you can smelt. Basically, it uses the smelting attribute of an item, so the more you can smelt, the better. Cool. You're also going to need to give it water, and there's a couple ways to get water into this thing. You can go ahead and use the aqueous accumulator that we saw last time, or we can take a look at tanks. Tanks are pretty cool. They can store liquids. You're going to need a redstone servo, which isn't too hard to make. But once you've got that, you can go ahead and make yourself the basic portable tank. This guy, not too shabby, as you can see, holds 10,000 millibuckets, otherwise known as 10 buckets. Pretty straightforward. But guess what? You can totally upgrade it. That's right. You can go ahead and turn it into a hardened version, which holds 40,000 or 40 buckets worth. You can go ahead and upgrade it to the next tier, which goes ahead and holds 90 buckets worth. Neat. The next tier, 160 buckets. And then finally, the resonant tier will totally hold 250 buckets. There is a creative tier as well, which will basically give you an infinite amount of that water type. So for example, if we wanted to have an infinite amount of water, we can go ahead and give it a creative tier, and we would just go throw a bucket of water in there, and it'll forever provide water. The nice thing about buckets is you can either pipe it into any kind of fluid pipe, or if you hit it with a crescent hammer, it'll turn orange, which means it'll automatically output its liquid below it, including to the block below it. So now we've automatically filled up our steam dynamo with water. And if we wanted to, we can go ahead and get ourselves a piece of coal and just throw it in there. And it'll start producing steam. And once it's started to produce steam, it'll start producing power. And that power will go ahead and start transferring directly into the adjacent energy cell where the dynamo is facing. Neat. And in case you didn't notice the variation on a theme here, you can go ahead and upgrade these dynamos as well. Now this thing's able to produce 60 RF a tick, and it's also got an augment slot. Cool. Now we've got 80, 100, and 120 RF a tick. Cool. So by upgrading this thing, it's definitely going to increase the amount of RF that it's going to produce over time, which is great. And it's also going to give augment slots. Also gives you access to redstone control. Sweet. So what augments are available for this thing? Well, we can go ahead and take a look at the auxiliary transmission coil. Dynamos, increased output, increases power generation of RF per tick. Neat. So let's go ahead and get a few of these. We'll put all 4 in there, because why not? And it's going to rapidly increase it to 600 RF a tick. How cool is that? I like it. So let's throw like a stack of coal in there, and you'll see it's going to quickly burn through the fuel, right? But that's fine. The other thing you can do is get some fuel catalyzers. These guys will go ahead and increase the efficiency. Basically allows you to get more energy produced by fuel. So instead of producing, let's say, what is it for coal in a steam dynamo? 48,000 RF a tick, you'll get more RF per piece of coal, but obviously it's at the cost of these things, so it might come in a lower amount of RF per tick. Cool. So you can see now your piece of fuel, your piece of coal, is lasting a lot longer. If for some reason you felt the need to pipe liquids into the front of this thing, which is totally something that can happen every now and then, you're going to need an augment to allow you to do that, and that is transmission coil ducting. Basically, it allows you to insert and extract both items and liquids, some of these dynamos require items, through the same side that you would normally be hooking up to power. So if you need that, go ahead and throw it in there. Pretty straightforward. Another really useful augment, and this one I like in particular, is called the excitation field limiter. Let me show you what happens without this thing, and then we'll see what happens with it. So let's go ahead and put these augments in there so that we can produce, 600 RF a tick. We're going to let the internal capacitor of the steam dynamo fill up. And you'll notice that as the steam dynamo's internal capacitor fills up, it's going to go ahead and slow down the power output. So it's going to produce less and less RF a tick as the internal capacitor fills up. And it's also going to kind of conserve the fuel a little bit. But there's a limit to how much that can happen. The excitation field limiter completely bypasses that limit and stops it completely. Basically what it means, it's going to prevent RF loss due to flux coil saturation. In other words, when the internal capacitor fills up, it's going to completely halt power generation and prevent the wasting of any fuel, which is great. So let's go ahead and throw this guy in here. We'll notice that as things start to get full, and it's right around the 90% mark is what I've noticed, when this thing will kind of cut itself off. And there we go. We just hit the 90% mark, and we can see that it completely stopped, which is cool. Now, without this thing in there, it'll continue producing RF, right? And it'll continue using fuel even once it's completely saturated. Once it's completely saturated, I think it's full, it won't use another piece of coal. But if it had already used a piece of coal, it's going to keep burning it up like most things would. Just like a furnace, when you put one piece of sand in there and a whole piece of coal, it's going to waste that coal. With the excitation field limiter, it holds on to that level of heat, which is pretty neat. And that's pretty cool. So long story short, this reduces your chance to waste fuel when you've got a full internal dynamo. But, of course, that's up to you if you want to install that thing. Neat. So that's the steam dynamo, 4 tiers of power upgrade, and then, of course, augments as well. There's other dynamos. Let's take a look at them. Now, before we move on to other dynamos, I do want to mention there's a turbine conversion. This is a specialization for the steam dynamo. Much like we saw specializations like the trivection chamber and the flux anodizers, this specialization makes it so that you get a lot more power generation out of your steam. However, it notes on the red tooltip, steam must be provided from an external source. So if you go ahead and install this thing here, it's no longer going to be allowed to smelt coal. See? No more coal smelting. Doesn't work. Sorry, you got to pump in your own steam, which you can get from somewhere else. At this point of this mod spotlight, there's no way to produce steam directly through thermal expansion. Other mods can produce steam for you, but I believe it's on the to-do list that there might be a steam producing block separate from the steam dynamo that would make this completely work by itself with thermal expansion, which would be cool. Now let's take a look at the Magmatic Dynamo, which, as you can probably guess, and I'm going to go ahead and throw a resonant conversion kit in there. 120 RF a tick, all it does is burn up, you guessed it, lava. Neat. And the same rules apply in terms of augments and all that stuff. Magmatic Dynamo, you can see it will burn either lava for 180,000 RF a tick, or you can go ahead and give it blazing pyrotheum, which gives it a lot more RF potential per bucket. Blazing pyrotheum comes from pyrotheum dust, which is a combination of sulfur, pulverized coal, redstone, and blaze powder. So if you go ahead and process that and get it, you'll get a lot more total RF out of blazing pyrotheum. And we'll go ahead and dump that power into there. You can see pretty quickly burning through at 120 RF a tick that lava. Cool. Now, one of the upgrades that you can put in here, another specialization, is the isentropic reservoir. Lemming with the names. Come on, dude. I'm not that good at pronouncing normal words. Anyway, this Magmatic Dynamo specialization greatly increases power gen and efficiency. However, once you do so, it's going to have a second chamber, which requires, you guessed it, coolant. Nice. So we go ahead and throw coolant in there, and now it's going to produce 320 RF a tick. Pretty much doubles it, right? But, you know, it requires coolant now to run. Neat. I like it. That's pretty cool, actually. And we throw a bunch of auxiliary transmission coils in there, which might be over here some more. Yeah, so total 680 RF a tick. Not bad. Whereas with just this in there, it would be 600. So basically you get a little bit more RF a tick. Not bad. And remember, this is a specialization, so you can only have one. So it's just basically better, but of course it does require coolant, so keep that in mind. The compression dynamo is basically your fuel machine, right? So you can use liquefacted coal, naphtha, refined fuel, tree oil. These are a couple of the liquids that we saw in the first part of the spotlight, how to make them. So refined fuel obviously being the best, but obviously also requiring the most effort through fractioning. Cool. Now with this, you also need coolant as well, so keep that in mind. So you're going to need some liquid cryotheum to keep the thing cool, and you're also going to need something like, I don't know, naphtha, right? And that's going to wind up producing RF for you. Cool. It's going to use up some gelid cryotheum. One of the augments that you can put on this would be a pretty fancy one. A specialization for this guy, closed loop cooling. Basically, coolant is no longer consumed for operation. Neat. Keep in mind that that's using up an augment slot, so it's up to you. Do you want to have 4 of these auxiliary transmission coils, or 3, but no longer need to feed coolant in there? Up to you. If making coolant is easy, not a problem. And don't forget, you can also use water as a coolant, so you don't have to use gelid cryotheum. Water is a perfectly valid coolant for a lot of stuff. It uses it much more quickly, so you have to have like a steady supply of water in there, where gelid cryotheum you don't need to use as often, but pretty neat. Speaking of coolant, don't forget thermal mediators work next to dynamos. So as long as you have a one of these guys next to your dynamo with something like gelid cryotheum in there, you'll notice that you'll be able to produce RF a little bit more quickly. Neat. The next guy to show you is the reactant dynamo. It runs by creating a reaction between a solid fuel source and a liquid fuel source. And we take a look at the reactant dynamo right here, you'll be able to see what those are. So the liquid fuel source options are glowstone, redstone, Zephyrian aerothium, lemming please, and creosote oil, right? And this stuff is basically aerothium dust in a magma crucible. Aerothium dust coming from blitz powder, niter, sand, and redstone. And blitz powder you can get from blitz rods, which are, you know, dropped from mobs that are added by thermal foundation, or you can just pump some destabilized redstone into sand and you get blitz powder. Cool. So that's one option, right? This is pretty much the best one, the Zephyrium aerothium. If you want, you can check it out. It's about twice as good as using energized glowstone, which you can use in there. For solid fuels, you can use gas tiers, nether stars if you want for really good stuff, or sugar, gunpowder, or blaze rods. Or blaze powder, I mean. So those are your options for the reactant dynamo. This doesn't have any particular specialization. One more note about the compression dynamo. There is a specialization that greatly increases power gen and efficiency, but it makes it so that only fuel can be used. Next up is the Ennovation Dynamo, which is a pretty useful device. Basically, you can give it redstone to create power, but you can also give it an energy cell, which is pretty neat in that it'll drain the energy out of the energy cell. So like it's kind of a way to convert an energy cell directly into energy through the Ennovation Dynamo. You can see that it's draining energy out of the energy cell, its current charge, and pretty much producing energy out of it. Neat. And the final dynamo to show you guys is the numismatic generator, or numismatic dynamo. This guy uses those coins that we saw earlier. So Enderium coin produces 64,000 RF, Lumium coin produces 48,000. You can see the other metrics there. So basically, the better the coin, the more RF it generates. Pretty cool. And that pretty much wraps it up for all the dynamos. Now there's a few other gadgets to take a look at. Specifically, one of the things I'd like to show you is the cache. The basic cache right here is pretty neat. What does it do? It's basically a barrel. So you can go ahead and drop items in there, and it can store a certain amount. You can also lock it so that it, always has that amount on there. So it's very similar to a barrel mechanic. Neat. And you can also pick it up easily, and it'll have the contents in there. So currently, it holds 448 stone and has a capacity of 20,000. Neat. Now, just like regular barrels from other mods, you can only hold one item type at a time, even if it's unlocked. But when it's unlocked, you can completely empty it, and it'll be completely emptied, and you can put something else in there. However, if it's locked, even if you completely empty it, it won't remove that lock. Cool. Shift right click to add or remove the lock. Neat. And then if you want, as you probably guessed by now, you can upgrade this thing all the way up to the resonant tier. Neat. At the resonant tier, it's capable of holding 500,000 items. Sweet. Finally, there's also the creative conversion kit, probably useful for map makers because, like we said, there's no creative version available. This basically makes it an unlimited amount of items. So its contents is stone. That means you can get an unlimited amount of stone out of that thing. Might be useful for some map makers for sure. And finally, there are florbs. Oh, glorious florbs. They are so much fun. Florbs basically are throwable liquids. You can combine florbs with pretty much any liquid that's available and go ahead and throw it in the world. So if you had destabilized redstone in a florb, for example, when you throw it, wherever it lands, it's going to place, you guessed it, 1 bucket's worth of redstone. Remember, there's certain attributes that are applied to this stuff. So for example, if we got ourselves an empty bucket here and scooped up this liquid redstone, there are different things you can do with it. For example, destabilized redstone transmits a redstone signal whatever it touches. So for example, as soon as it's touching the sky, you can see the redstone signal being applied. Neat, right? And liquid Enderium, for example, you remember what that does, right? Resonant Ender. Teleports anybody who touches it randomly. Neat. Different metrics, right? There's gelid cryothium florbs, which freeze things. And they all have different viscosities and different ways that they flow, right? Some flow like lava, some don't. This stuff typically makes some snow show up wherever it's at. Blazing pyrothium. Don't recommend throwing it into a forest, like I just did. Really a bad idea. Highly, highly suggest you don't, unless you want to have a lot of fun. And there's obviously a few other things, right? Neat. Energized glowstone, as a reminder, does float up into the air. So it has the opposite flowing mechanic of water and lava in that it floats upwards. And I think that aerothium stuff probably does as well. And energized glowstone does give off light, by the way. And if you stand in it, you get a jump boost and a speed boost. Neat. And this gives you, invisibility and water breathing. That's cool. Alright guys, so I think that's a good wrapping up point. We've checked out pretty much everything there is to check out in thermal expansion. As mentioned, thermal dynamics should be around pretty soon, and we'll have a mod spotlight on that as well. We can see all the flux ducts and item conduits and liquid conduits, and yes, viaducts are indeed back. Whoosh. Alright guys, Darryl20 signing off. Hope you guys enjoyed the mod spotlights. For now, take it easy.